Let's review Chapter 249 of Jujutsu Kaisen. And this week we are coming off a 1-week break after a 3-week break, which kind of feels like we've been on hiatus the whole year. But finally, JJK is back and we have a banger of a chapter, especially if you are a Yuta fan. And we even get the full reveal of what exactly happened to Kenjaku, because we open up right where we left off with Yuta, where he is standing over Kenjaku's decapitated body. And after being decapitated, Kenjaku has seemingly lost most of his control over his cursed spirits, and they just erupt from his body. And unfortunately, we don't get to see any really cool cursed spirit designs here. Most of them are just put into a giant blob, and the ones we do see, they're alright, but there's nothing on the level of the one we saw with Yuki. But minor gripes like that aside, we get to see that Kenjaku is still alive. He is a floating head being held by one cursed spirit. And this is exceptionally goofy looking, but he uses this opportunity to add one more Culling Games rule. And this would be the same rule we saw before, where now Megumi Fushiguro can start the merger, i.e. Sukuna. And we see him take out Tengen, who is looking like a curse womb, and he just catapults her over to Sukuna. And I'll be honest, I was not expecting thrusters to be attached to Tengen for him to just rocket her over. But now we get to what is probably the most controversial part of this chapter, is that Kenjaku gets his head impaled by Yuta's katana. And if there was any question before as to whether or not Kenjaku was going to survive here, him getting double tapped in the brain when he is just a brain is pretty clear. So I guess that is just the end of Kenjaku, and honestly, I am not the biggest fan of this ending. I never liked Kenjaku as a villain that much, but this is just not it. It just feels like Kenjaku died 80% of the way into his story, and there's more that should be told, but we're never going to see it. And as Yuta's katana enters Kenjaku's skull, he says, "I'm glad the one I got to play with at the end of my life was him," referring to Takaba. And then presumably he dies, and really that seems to be the case because it would take a miracle to bring him back at this point. But after Kenjaku's death, we cut back to Yuta versus Sukuna, and Yuta is looking a little depressed because he is starting to notice that Sukuna's RCT output is getting back to normal. And it is only a matter of time until he can use Malevolent Shrine once again. So Yuta is starting to wonder if he really should have gone after Kenjaku, or if he should have stayed here to prevent Sukuna from recovering. And he comes to the conclusion that only Rika's power could have prevented civilian casualties from all of Kenjaku's cursed spirits. And I understand where Yuta is coming from, but I don't necessarily agree because the merger is an existential threat to the entire country. And most of these cursed spirits got released inside of the barriers, and the barriers aren't down yet because the Culling Games are still ongoing. And letting Sukuna recover is kind of fumbling the one opportunity that Gojo died for. And I do like the explanation that Sukuna's RCT is still slow and he is not at full power because it makes Gojo's sacrifice a little less baloney. Before this, it was just Mahoraga getting taken down, which is a big deal, but it just doesn't hit as hard as him being actively injured. But after Yuta's internal dialogue, we enter the first true confrontation between Yuta and Sukuna. Yuta utilizes Rika to create what looks like a black cloak of cursed energy to stab Sukuna with a surprise attack. But Sukuna makes a bunch of small slashes around his hand, kind of like a chainsaw, to grab onto the katana. And this is the second time that Yuta has forced Sukuna to bolster his defenses to stop his katana. It looks like Yuta's output is so high that Sukuna's basic reinforcement is just not enough. It's either that or Sukuna is worried that there is more to this katana and it is some kind of cursed tool and he simply doesn't want to find out. But Yuta Okkotsu does a big brain move and lets go of his katana to lay the hands on Sukuna, nailing him with a punch right in the gut. And it was enough to make Sukuna's stomach mouth make a grunt. Sukuna proceeds to backhand Rika, and we get the classic Jujutsu jumping of a 2v1 with Rika and Yuta versus Sukuna. And Yuta actually comes to his senses and says that he got them into this situation because he wanted to be the one to kill Kenjaku. And he proceeds to open his domain, all-encompassing, unequivocal love. And within his domain, he can copy curse techniques unconditionally, and he has 51 katanas people have counted laying about. And each one of these is likely one of his different curse techniques, and this is just one of the coolest looking domains for me personally. I always thought that Yuta had the katana factor, but having 50 extra katanas, now that is anime. That is at least a 35% increase to overall plot armor. And Sukuna immediately opens up a hollow wicker basket, wasting absolutely no time. But Yuta has zero chill, grabbing one of the katanas off the ground, slashing Sukuna and saying, "Thin icebreaker." There was a massive explosion, the katana in Yuta's hand starts to crumble. And this has a lot of people thinking, myself included, that he might only be able to use the curse techniques in here one time per katana, though they might just come back because it did say unconditional copy. And Sukuna starts to realize that their plan is to keep his mouths and arms occupied with Hollow Wicker Basket and defending against the sure hit, which he assumes is probably Angel's technique, which will just obliterate him in one shot. At least it'll obliterate him if it works anything like it did before, which really it should, because Yuta is undeniably a stronger sorcerer than Angel was. But all of this hinges on Yuji Itadori and his soul-seizing punches to rip Megumi right out of Sukuna. And Sukuna mocks Yuji, saying, "Looks like you finally found your role," and that is where the chapter ends, with Yuta and Yuji going up against the king. And overall, I think this chapter is great. I don't like the Kenjaku stuff, but that's whatever, you know. Sukuna versus Yuta was amazing. Even if Yuta does die, at least he lived long enough for us to actually see what his domain expansion does. That is more than I can say for Ryu, Yuki, and probably Uro, who I'm guessing is dead at this point. And if she's not, her thin icebreaker is better used with Yuta anyways. But these soul-tearing punches, that's something I want to dig into because we're finally in Soul Kaisen. We've talked about Yuji being able to interact with the soul for a long time, and it is kind of disappointing that we don't get the explanation from this for Kenjaku, at least for me. Unless he pulls a Mechamaru and tells the audience what's up after death, but I just don't see that happening. But having Yuji be the one to interact with Sukuna's soul and tear Megumi from him, I think that's pretty fitting. I'm guessing he got this power after reading the book on the soul and having Sukuna inside of him. Because if it was just the book, I think pretty much everybody should be able to learn how to do this. But the key reason Yuji is the only one to have this is likely because Sukuna was inside of him for so long, so he has a better understanding of the soul than pretty much anybody. As for their overall plan here, I'm guessing they're going to get pretty close, but then Sukuna's going to get his domain expansion back, and then we'll have a massive fight there. We already have the setup that both Gojo and Yuji notice that the center of Sukuna's malevolent shrine, the big shrine itself, might be the key to destroying it. So if these guys do get caught in the massive blender, because I'm guessing Hikari and Maki are going to show up, I might be in the minority for this, but I'm hoping that Hikari just off-screens Urame. That way Maki and Hikari can show up to fight Sukuna simultaneously. And as for where Maki is right now, a lot of people think she's currently inside of the barrier, just stealthing around. And given the power set of Maki, using her as a strike team member, that just seems like the best use for her because she doesn't have RCT, she can't regrow a limb. And when you're dealing with a guy who chops people's limbs off all the time, having her in the forefront is just a terrible idea. And the last thing I want to talk about is Yuta's domain. If he has Jacob's Ladder here and all these other curse techniques, whatever they may be, this thing should be busted. If copying curse techniques in this domain is truly unconditional, this is a top 2, if not top 1 domain. And the craziest thing to me is just how young Yuta is pulling off feats like this. When Gojo said that Yuta might be one to be able to surpass him, I can honestly see where he's coming from because unconditional copying like this, that is just busted. And I really hope to see characters like Maki and Hikari live up to Gojo's legacy now that he gave his life to get them to this point. But those are my opinions on this chapter. I think it's a great one, like I said. I'm not a big fan of Kenjaku dying. I'm sure many people are going to be upset about that. And while the theory train has kind of slowed down now that Kenjaku is dead and JJK is kind of catapulting to its end, I still think what's here is really good, even if some of the complexity in the story is starting to simmer down a little bit. I'm expecting like one more plot twist and then the ending's trajectory will be pretty clear. But that's where I'm at with JJK. Tell me what you guys think in the comments below, and if you like content like this, subscribe for more. And as always, thanks for watching.